into the United States. Countries around the world gasped in fright and horror, and markets around the world collapsed. The S&P 500 in the United States has lost almost 10% just in the past week, a drop not seen in markets since the early days of the COVID pandemic. What does all this mean for the global economy, for America's relations with its closest allies, and for the United States at home? Then we'll take a look at Secretary Pete Hegseth's first travel to Asia across the Pacific, leaving behind the single-gate story that was so preoccupying him here in Washington. He pledged in Asia to work with America's key allies, particularly Japan and the Philippines, but he did skip a visit to South Korea, even though there are 28,000 American troops on that continent and have been there since 1950. So what does this visit and the debate that is happening within the Trump administration really tell us about this administration's approach to Asia? And then finally, political upheaval in France, where a court convicted Marine Le Pen on absconding funds and immediately barred her from running for public office for the next 5 years, effectively ruling out a fourth consecutive bid for the presidency, which is supposed to take place in 2027. How has Le Pen and her party, the Rally National, reacted to the verdict? And what does the future of French politics now look like? Here to help answer these questions are three reporters who are covering these stories. Suzanne Lynch is the author of Politico's Global Playbook. Gideon Rachman is chief foreign affairs commentator for the FT. And Ken Moriyasu is Washington correspondent for Nikkei Asia. Welcome all. Good afternoon. And Gideon, wonderful to see you. Suzanne, first time on. Love to have you here. Ken, great to see you. I know you're in Washington. Gideon, let's start with you. The big story, inevitably, tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. A beautiful word that I think the rest of the world would rather not have seen uttered on the public stage this week, because the consequences seem to be pretty dire. Tell us, what did Trump do? What do you think the impact is going to be, and how will this evolve?
Gosh, I think Trump essentially blew up the world trading system, and as a result, both America's major trading partners, who coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, also America's leading allies, are in big trouble. I mean, China's an exception; it's not an ally. I mean, it's a big trading partner. Economically, but also America's markets are in enormous turmoil, as you may have noticed. I mean, I can't think I'm the only one who's now addicted to watching, the Wall Street Journal, the FT figures for the plunge in the Dow, the plunge in the Nasdaq, and so on. So basically, he's unleashed turmoil, and I think that it's very hard to know how it's resolved, because he is, as you said, tariff is his favorite word, but it's also his favorite theory. There was one of the very few ideas that Trump has consistently put himself behind, but one of them is that America's unfairly treated by the allies of trading partners. I think he sees trade deficits as the equivalent of like a profit and loss account on a company balance sheet. So if it's a minus figure, that's obviously bad. We're losing money. And we, until that's in the black, that can't be good. So no trade economist would subscribe to that view. But unfortunately, Trump has such power and such authority at the moment within his own administration and within the American system that he's able finally to impose this economically illiterate view. And we're seeing the consequences. The question is, can he do a 180 and pull back? Because I think if he doesn't, these losses in the markets will continue for a while. But then you'll have the second order economic effects, that you'll see a collapse in trade. You'll see, and those effects will show up in, say, a country like Vietnam. You feel devastated for. They built their entire economy around exporting to the United States. Does America really want to make, cheap T-shirts and sort of plastic ducks for baths? You wouldn't think so, but that's been, as a much poorer country, that's their route out. And now, 45% tariff on them. So country by country, there'll be terrible effects on, Japan's talking about a national emergency and so on. Even Britain, which had a 10% tariff, Trump says, oh, they'll be delighted. So we also subject to the 25% tariff on automobiles. Cars are our second biggest export to the United States. So right across the world, people are sort of throwing up their hands in horror. But their only hope, bizarrely, is that things will be really bad in America as well, that you'll get inflation, that you'll get wipeouts of people's savings, and that Trump will be forced into a U-turn. But you're probably better placed than me to know whether that's likely to happen. The only transmission mechanism I can see is a revolt in the Republican Party. You're beginning to see hints of it with some senators trying to take back the tariff authority from Trump, but that has to go further. There has to be more senators, more people in the House, and maybe some of the big donors who've put their money and mouth behind Trump will turn.
It's a bleak picture, Ken, and in some ways, I wonder whether Tokyo saw this one coming. Of course, Prime Minister Yoshida had an early visit with the president. It went sort of okay to the extent any visit can go well with President Trump, unless you have a king who can invite you to come to
or can play golf.
Scotland. Or you can play golf, I guess. That's the other thing, which is what Alex Stubb, the Finnish prime minister, did for 7 hours last weekend. Finnish president. But 24% on Japan is really extraordinary. A country that has had its trade issues with the United States back in the 1980s, but has worked out a relationship. So how is Asia reacting, and what do you think in Japan in particular, but also other countries? I mean, Singapore got hit, Vietnam, of course, and Cambodia, 49%, not known as the richest countries. And of course, China, which was hit with 34% and is now hit back pretty hard. What does the picture look like? I know you're in Washington. We can talk about that too. But what does the picture look like from the Asian continent?
All right. So I'll begin with an anecdote. The Chinese embassy here is just as puzzled as us. And their greatest takeaway from that press conference was the fact that Trump, in the initial opening stages, pointed to J.D. Vance and said, J.D.'s gaining a lot of confidence these days. And then there was a shot of the front row of the cabinet members, and the Chinese noticed that J.D. Vance was sticking his legs out very comfortably. So their takeaway was, wow, J.D. Vance seems very comfortable in this administration. As for the tariffs, they have no idea what's happening. But as always, I think it's important to try to understand what the Trump team is trying to do. And I think there's three goals of this tariff policy. One is to reshore certain industries to America. The second is to rebuild America's coffers through the tariff revenue. And three is to weaken China. And if you look at the announced tariffs, there's three categories. And each of these categories are designed to gain those three goals. So first is the 10% baseline tariff for everybody. And then there's the so-called reciprocal tariffs, although they're not reciprocal at all, but it's an individual country by country tariff, which go as high as 49% for Cambodia. And then there's the Section 232 tariffs, which were not imposed on Wednesday, but they are for steel and aluminum and autos. 25%. They've been announced already, and the White House is hinting that there'll be more for semiconductors and pharmaceuticals very soon. So as for, and of those three, I think the only negotiable one is the reciprocal tariffs, and I'll get to that. First of all, the 10% baseline tariff. I think this is a new consumption tax on the American people. And this is not going to go away. And the goal of this is to rebuild the national coffers and to gain new revenue to rebuild America. The Section 232 tariffs on specific industries are targeted to reshore them. So automobile, semiconductors, the Trump team needs these to be in America. Because they think that overdependence on China, obviously, but even for among allies, will make America vulnerable in a future war. And the reciprocal tariffs is the one that can be negotiated. And I think this is the goal of this is to weaken China. The White House officials in their briefing to the reporters said the reason why Cambodia is charged 49% and Vietnam is charged 46% is because they are transshipment sites for China. China actually moves their goods to these countries to reship to America without tariffs. And they was given an example of a Vietnam factory, which looks like a factory from satellite photos, but inside all they're doing is bringing in Chinese-made goods, repackaging them as made in Vietnam to ship them to America. So I think they want to close the loopholes through these very high tariffs on Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and Sri Lanka. And the goal there is to force China into negotiations. What they want, Trump has repeatedly said he wants concessions on TikTok, and I think he wants more stability on the Taiwan issue, so some kind of guarantee that the status quo is realized. So from my standpoint, there is kind of clarity in what he's trying to do.
Clarity, Suzanne, when it's seen from the European Commission's perspective. After all, this comes after some big hits on Ukraine, on European defense. At the same time, is there a sense here there's a strategy that we can work with, or how does the European Union, which of course acts as a trade negotiator for all EU countries, reacting to this?
Yeah, this was the big story in Brussels this week. Obviously, the tariffs that were announced, and the EU was hit with a 20% tariff. I mean, I think how it fits into the parallel and connected debate about defense and security. In one way, when it comes to defense and security, the European Union and Europe, but particularly the European Union, is so on the back foot. Obviously, years of underinvestment, and they've been racing to catch up. There's an existential crisis now about Europe's ability to defend itself because America is not presenting itself as the security guarantor once it was. But when it comes to trade, the European Union is much more confident on trade grounds because this is what the EU is good at. I mean, trade, the single market. People talk about the EU being set up as a peace project, but the EU was also set up as an economic project. You know, the steel and coal community in the early days, the idea that you had America on one side, you had the Soviet Union on the other, and you had Europe in between, that the best way to approach economic and international affairs was to club together. That was the basic idea of the EU. So it is a market of 450 million people, which is just huge. Its own power in the global trading system. Now, I know it's not just a matter of, you know, our country, our bloc is bigger than yours. It's a lot more complex than that, but it does give the EU a lot more heft on this. In saying that, what is happening now as we record this is that, you know, there are meetings going on internally within the EU because, yes, the European Commission will negotiate on this on behalf of the 27 member states of the EU. But as always, when it comes to Brussels, there's going to be divisions, and there are already divisions within the EU. And that's mainly now about how hard the EU should, you know, fight back. So you've got all these countries and there are different levels of exposure. Some countries have this gaping surplus that others don't, etc. So, you know, and there are different pinch points. So now what we're seeing is that early next week, we're going to have a meeting of EU trade ministers where you've got each trade minister from each European country coming out and setting up their stall. But by mid next week, we're likely to get the first countermeasures against the original steel and aluminum tariffs that were announced by Trump. But generally, you know, I do think that the EU, that the message, particularly from Emmanuel Macron during the week, I mean, it was fascinating. He actually said that European countries or companies should maybe rethink investment in America and pause that investment. And we've had leader after leader going to Washington telling Donald Trump, oh, look, our companies invest in America. It's a two-way street. And now we've Macron coming out and saying that. I mean, the only other element I would say, picking up from Ken's point there, which was fascinating about, you know, Vietnam's role vis-a-vis China. The other issue, of course, is because China is so central to this, is the impact Chinese overcapacity is going to have on the European market. Are we going to see China now racing to sell their goods into other markets, including Europe, and the impact of that? So that's a whole kind of secondary issue. That's a big one for everyone, really, but here it's a big issue for the European Union, and Commission officials here in Brussels are certainly concerned about that too.
Gideon, pick up that point, because I think if this blows up the trading system at least the U.S. central role in that playing system, in that trading system, as you said. There are other actors who have agency, and of course, the Chinese have agency. The European Union, Suzanne has just laid out. The Asian powers are not, they're not little economies, Japan in particular, but the Southeast Asian countries, Canada, which is nonplussed by what's happening, including has already retaliated on the car parts and automobile tariffs. Do you get a sense that these countries are saying, maybe the era of America's global leadership is over, but it doesn't mean the era of us cooperating together and working together has to end, and we have to give in, but there's actually an alternative?
Yeah, no, I think that's very much the debate. We'll see whether it can be put into action. But yeah, I mean, I think the idea of globalization continuing, but without America for a while, I mean, that's a simplified version, is very much in action. And so the EU will say, look, we already signed this deal with Mercosur, Latin America, which is yet to be ratified. We now really need to push ahead with that. That we should also do a trade deal with India. Easier said than done. Many people have said that. But maybe now the Indians have been hit with tariffs, they too will begin to at least see the need to talk about this more seriously. And China's the big one, though, because as Suzanne says, it's a tricky customer because they do have all this industrial capacity. The EU, I think one of the wins of the Biden administration was actually persuading or creating a sort of transatlantic approach to China, which was coming into action around the common principle of de-risking. And, we'll continue to trade with China, but try to be more restrictive on key technologies and things like that. And the EU and the US were on the same page. Now I think there's a chance of a big divergence with the Europeans saying, well, there's really no point in continuing to work with the Americans. And actually, you'll hear people say in the EU, if we're going to be serious about the green transition, we can't do it without China. We need their solar panels, their EVs, and so on. So we can probably forge an agreement with them where they begin to open car plants in Europe in the way the Japanese did in America and Europe in the late 80s and early 90s. And that's the model. And that's the broad principle. Of course, it can all fall apart when you actually begin to see surges of Chinese goods into Europe that are destroying what few manufacturing jobs remain. But I think that's the idea. But I also think another thing that may happen increasingly is regionalization, so that there'll be increased emphasis on Europe trying to complete its own single market on the near abroad, maybe more sort of pan-Asian deals without the United States, and more of that.
Ken, I want to jump in on the conversation, but also bring in the Asian perspective, and then we can probably also move to our second topic, which was Hegseth's visit and sort of debate that you already started talking about within the administration about how serious do we take, on the one hand, the China threat, on the other hand, the need for a deal. And it's clearly the president wants a deal. But what does that deal mean, and how do they respond to that? But of course, Japan is not an actor in that deal. The South Koreans weren't even part of the visit. So how are they looking at the possibility of responding both in the trade way that we just talked about, but also more largely in the way the administration has been focused on, or actually not really focused on China up till in Asia up till now?
All right. So very brief answer. I didn't respond to your question about how Japan sees the tariff issue. So I'll answer that and then move on to the Hegseth trip. So if you look at Japan's exports to the US, 26% of it is automobiles, and I think 7% is automobile parts. So those together form more than 30%. And that automobile sector fits into the Section 232 tariffs, meaning America is determined to reshore those industries. So there is no negotiation for Japan around that. So they would have to reshore or build in America. The strategy until now was to build in Mexico and bring it tariff-free across the border due to NAFTA initially and now USMCA, but that is being shut off. So the Japanese companies are going to have to build in America. I think Navarro has said in interviews that the factory utilization rate of automobile factories in America is about 60%. So if Toyota or BMW has a factory in America, like BMW has in South Carolina, you just increase that rather than bringing it from Germany. So companies that do have existing American factories will be forced to build in America. For companies like Mazda, who basically all the production is in Mexico, that's really troubling because they have to have a greenfield investment in America. That's going to be really tough. They have already started to build with Toyota in Alabama, so they will heavily utilize those capacities. Now, going to the Hegseth trip. So Pete Hegseth made his first trip to the Indo-Pacific, stopping in Hawaii, Guam, Philippines, and Japan. And if you look at his statements, and he went to Iwo Jima and made a very nice speech there. But if you look at the public statements, it was very reassuring to the allies, especially Philippines and Japan. In the Philippines, he said the alliance is ironclad and that they are going to double down on the Philippine-US relationship. In Japan, there were rumors before the trip that they might cancel the upgrading of the United States Forces Japan into a joint headquarters. He said, no, we are going to do that. We are going to kick off phase 1 of that. So that was reassuring. But then I think it would be a mistake to consider this as a continuation of the Biden policies, because as you say, South Korea was not included in the trip. And I don't think this is a coincidence. And also, another interesting fact was that in Guam, on the second stop, he announced a $2 billion investment in the federally rated states of Micronesia, especially a state called Yap, which is very close to Guam. $2 billion in this time of age, in this Doge era, is quite a commitment. And it signals to me that the US strategy is to pull back to the second island chain, because the so-called first island chain, which is Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines, is just too dangerous in the threat of Chinese military capability. Now, going back to South Korea, I think in this administration, there is a consensus about the importance of the Philippines, Japan, Australia, and India, the maritime powers. But when it comes to South Korea, there is no consensus whether South Korea is part of the strategy to fend off China, and whether South Korea should be defended, whether South Korea is included in the strategic line of defense. And since that is not concluded, there was no way for Hegseth to go and to commit to any kind of ironclad relationship. Now, there is still, I think, a battle among the officials for the direction of the foreign policy. There are 3 camps in the Republican Party: the so-called global primicists, the prioritizers, and the restrainers. And yesterday there was reports that many people, up to 6 officials, were fired from the National Security Council. If you look at the background of the people who were fired, 2 of the staff were former staffers of Marco Rubio. One of them was a close aide to Mike Waltz. One of them was the son of Douglas Feith, who was a key neocon figure in the Bush administration. So what is the common thread there? I think the restrainers are winning. They are getting rid of the so-called primicists, or the Reaganite wing of the Republican Party, who thinks that military, the use of military to gain diplomatic gains is important. I think that is being sidelined. And as you said, Mike Waltz did stand up for his staff, but was pushed. He couldn't defend any of them. So I don't know if it's any of them, but he couldn't defend all of them. So I think that's very telling.
Yeah, I think he was able to defend his deputy, Alex Wong, who was also clearly in the crosshairs of Laura Loomer, who now seems to be running personnel in the White House, even though she has no formal role. Suzanne, interesting that just as this conversation is taking place at NATO headquarters in Brussels, you had the 4 foreign ministers of the so-called Indo-Pacific partners, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. Only one country of which Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, actually went to visit. So when Europe, which has now invested, particularly the NATO members in Europe, has invested in this partnership with what's called the Indo-Pacific Four, looks at where is the United States going? Does that lead to strengthening of ties with these four countries, or in some ways weakening it? How is this seen?
I think very much the former, and you're absolutely right. Just in the last couple of hours, Mark Rutte gave a press conference at the end of these 2 days of meetings. And I mean, it was pretty extraordinary. He was asked about it, but he talked about China quite a bit. It was just in the context of this retaliation by China on trade. And even though he said he didn't want to get into trade, he said we cannot be naive about China. He talked about that buildup of their defense industrial base, 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, their presence, their Navy presence, etc. And he also made the point that he said, linking it to what's happening in Ukraine, that if Russia wins this war in Ukraine in some way, he made a link that Xi could also have territorial claims that he could execute, basically. A reference maybe to Taiwan there, obviously. So, and the fact that China has, helped Russia in this war to circumvent sanctions. So he was very strong on this, that China is is a threat, and that NATO thinks this. He also said that he's going to go to Japan early next week, Rutte. So that's also interesting. So yes, to answer your question, I think this is very much now NATO showing that they're right to be concerned about the Indo-Pacific, to widen their remit, if you like. He also talked about the Arctic Circle and obviously Greenland there, but earlier in the week talked about Chinese presence in the Arctic Circle, for example. So I do think, to answer your question, that this is now a priority. And even though obviously NATO here has been subsumed by the Ukraine crisis, rightly so, if anything, that has underlined the need to be aware of what's happening further afield.
Yeah. And I guess, Gideon, that does raise the fundamental question for Europeans, Canadians, and of course the Asians, about what the U.S. policy towards Asia is going to be. Because I think if to sort of take the geographic version of Ken's three schools, the primacist would say we need to be everywhere where the Chinese are not. That includes South Korea. The China firsters would probably do the same thing. But I think Ken's point on the first versus the second island chain is a really important one. And just for our listeners and those who are watching, the first island chain is this chain from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines, and the second island chain runs through, Hawaii, Guam, and then through the Pacific Islands. And there's a real question about where is the United States going to draw its sphere of influence line geographically. Is it going to be California? Is it going to be Hawaii and Guam, which is U.S. territory, and Samoa? Or does it actually include what used to be, until very recently, very, very close and important allies from Australia, New Zealand, through the Philippines and Japan, and of course Taiwan?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is a really fascinating thing that's happening. So I think at the moment, my read is that there's been an informal alliance between the prioritizers, the guys who say don't do Europe but do China, and the restrainers, who basically want America to pull back all over the world, because they had a joint enemy in the primacists, the neocons, who they really didn't like. And so you have people like Elbridge Colby, whose still sort of nomination is still battling its way through the Senate, but will probably make it into the Pentagon, who is a prioritizer, who is a guy who wrote books saying we can't afford to defend Europe anymore. Essentially, the Europeans have got to do that so as we can concentrate all our forces in China, who's in alliance with the people around J.D. Vance, who I think are much more out-and-out restrainers, just do nothing, or do much, much less. And I think that Suzanne, or was it your point, that it's the restrainers who are kind of winning, is shown in the way that people like Colby are beginning to adapt their rhetoric. So that Colby, who wrote an entire book saying that Taiwan was an existential interest for America, is suddenly saying in his confirmation hearings, maybe Taiwan isn't an existential risk for America. Maybe we can't defend it, which suggests to me that in the interest of maintaining his viability, he's moving towards the restrainer camp. Now, I'm conscious I'm making all this commentary from the other side of the Atlantic, so tell me if I'm misreading it. But that's why my ears also pricked up when Ken said, the second island chain, because that really would be a radical move. And I doubt they would be that explicit about it. But it would certainly leave all America's traditional allies in Asia kind of dangling. But then I think the final thing, and I think it links to the question about Rutte, is whether we're all slightly being played for fools by trying to find a coherence in what is a bunch of incoherent, competing ideas being thrown at the wall. And you can see Rutte desperately trying to do this. He is the guardian of the transatlantic alliance. So whatever his private thoughts, he has to say, I'm fine with whatever's coming out of Washington. They've got a point, and so on. So if they're charging off in the direction of Asia, he'll charge off in that direction. If it's the Arctic, he'll charge towards the Arctic. It's all about sort of trying to keep these wheel, everything, all the plates spinning. But eventually, they're going to come crashing to the floor, particularly if in the end, it's not any of the three schools who's making the big decisions, but it's Laura Lunatic, who comes into the White House and says, sack everybody because, they're keeping kids in a pizza parlor in Washington. There's at a certain point, the sane washing can't work anymore.
Well, we don't do sane washing here. We only try to explain. Ken, your view on this, but also really interested to see how Tokyo's looking at this, because yes, Hegseth visit was what you would want from an ally, right? It can't be better than that. But does anybody believe that Hegseth actually speaks for the White House?
No, he does not. But I was listening to Gideon's podcast interview with a guy called Dan Caldwell, who is one of the leading restrainers and a very key figure in this administration. He used to belong to a think tank called Defense Priorities, which calls for restraint. And he said the moment that he realized that Trump has the right foreign policy was the 2016 South Carolina presidential debate, on which Rubio and Cruz and all those were on. And I went back to listen to it. And Trump says two very interesting things. He says, one, we need to rebuild the nation. And two, we can't fight two wars. And that was in 2016. And I think that is the underlying theme of his presidency. Rebuilding the nation is connected to the tariffs, and we cannot fight two wars is his foreign policy that was incorporated in the 2018 National Defense Strategy. But the interpretation of that differs between the prioritizers and the restrainers, and that's why I think there is no clear-cut path yet. But I do feel that the restrainers are winning. I think Japan is trying very hard to understand. So what the Chinese said about J.D. Vance is very interesting. Is J.D. Vance up or down? This is very important to China. It's very important to Japan as well.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when you said that thing about Trump saying, J.D. is looking very confident right now. That sounds to me like a threat coming from Trump.
But from the Chinese, I think it is trying to make J.D. Vance the future of American foreign policy, which I think would be extremely good for the Chinese from that perspective. Fascinating stuff. But Suzanne, let's use the last 10 minutes or so to talk about really an extraordinary case, and it's particularly extraordinary because I think the reaction inside France, in particular, is a little different than we have seen in other places, whether it's in Romania or indeed in the United States, when there are legal questions being raised about candidates and how and when they can run for office. Bring us up to date about what happened with Le Pen. What was she convicted of, and what was decided, and how the consequences are, how she's reacted to it, and what you expect will happen.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this was a very long-running case, and she was convicted of embezzlement of funds. Her party, which always had a very strong presence at the European Parliament in Brussels and Strasbourg, and that they had misused funds that were allocated to assistants who should have been working for their MEPs, and was in fact used for the party back home in France. That was basically the kernel of this. But the most significant part of it was there was a harsh ruling against her and the others. And they didn't know necessarily this was coming. So it was a real bombshell when it was announced this week. And she has been banned now for running for office for 5 years. And that will impinge on her ability to run in the presidential elections in 2027. Now, what has happened since then is that she's going to appeal this, and this appeal will be held and heard by the end of the summer next year. So let's see what happens there. So that has put a new slant on things. But it's, I'm here in Brussels. I'm trying to watch French TV when I can to improve my French, and you can imagine. I mean, it has been nonstop. It has been a huge focus here. And Marine Le Pen, she's been around for a while. People know her. She's a hugely important figure in France and in Europe. So I think the biggest question really now that Europe is grappling with is what this means for her party, and who is going to succeed her, which was always a question. I mean, there's always a question. Jordan Bardella, her anointed, we wouldn't quite say successor yet, but it's young. He's 29. He's been on TV here. He's a big TikTok influencer. And this idea that her party is trying to move away and has already moved away from its very toxic image that we associate with her father, and that he is appealing, Bardella in particular, to this younger voter. And I mean, just picking up on what Gideon mentioned in a different context about, adapting people's language, in the Senate hearings. I mean, what's the reality now is that a lot of the language used by the far right in France, the National Rally, is now entered the mainstream a bit more in France. So anti-immigration, all of this rhetoric has now been adopted by the centre. And so it has already become less toxic. And a lot of people then are happy to say they're voting for Marine Le Pen. So, last year in the European elections, the party got 31% of the vote. Her party is the biggest party in the National Assembly in France. So, but to your first question, I think there is overall, I mean, there's been polling done during the week. And yes, it falls along kind of party preference lines, but more or less the French people are saying, this is justice at work. They have a long history of seeing corruption by different politicians of different political parties. So even though there's a risk of her being kind of martyred by this, really the French people seem to be kind of mostly in favour of what happened. This is the law. However, it's interesting, of course, and there's a whole other debate how other far-right leaders have weighed in on this. So Viktor Orban was tweeting "Je suis Marine" during the week. And even overnight, we just heard the first reaction from Donald Trump himself, who I have to say was interesting. He said he'd never met the person, but he's called it a witch hunt, and he made parallels, of course, with what's happened to him and as he put it, this kind of politicized judiciary. So what's been interesting over the last few months is how particularly J.D. Vance, we were at Munich, used it zoning in on these very national issues across Europe to make it parallel and to tell a story about what they see as a kind of a shut out or silent majority of far-right politicians. But I think in France, that's not necessarily the debate that's happening. That's more outside.
Yeah, Suzanne, that was great as an overview. And Gideon, I think Suzanne's key point that the French people, and to some extent Marine Le Pen, has just accepted that this is the way the system works, and we're going to work within the system to try to get what they believe justice done, which is overthrow this. That's not the way that many others have reacted to whether it's what's happening in Israel, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Hungary. It's not how it's worked, and in some ways, this is salutary and reminds me of Boris Johnson accepting the Supreme.
Totally.
Court's ruling and said at some point the rule of law actually matters.
Yeah, and I think a key proposition of the far right is that there is no such thing as a depoliticized judiciary or depoliticized rule of law. Everything is political. It's a bit like Marxists. Everything is political. Everything reflects power structures. So don't believe that the courts are independent. Don't believe that they're not acting at the behest of the currently powerful. And in a liberal society, for a liberal society to survive, people have to accept that the law is separate from politics and that the law can operate impartially, even if, they may accept that individual judges, lean left or lean right or whatever. And if that view is still holding in France, that is a good sign. And I think one reason that it may be holding is that, the French have seen other politicians who are not far right also taken out by the courts. I mean, I remember when Alain Juppé was meant to be, the guy who was going to be the next president. He's centre right. He ended up getting sent to prison, and he was taken out of the game. The same with François Fillon. He never went to court, but his, it was a corruption allegation, blew up his presidential candidacy. Nicolas Sarkozy, I think, is currently having to wear an ankle bracelet because of the court. So this isn't just something that happens to the far right. And if the French understand that, that is, very good and important. And is a big contrast with the United States. I mean, it struck me that in a way, France and America took different paths. In France, they stuck with it. They took the case, and they were prepared to see through the consequences. In for whatever reason, the Biden administration or the Justice Department under the Biden administration moved so slowly on Trump that these cases never came to fruition before the presidential election, with the results that we see now. And if I can be allowed a little editorializing, I mean, I think there is a reason for preventing criminals from running for office, because if they've committed crimes before, that might be a guide to how they behave once they're in power.
Yes, except when you have a Supreme Court saying that that's perfectly okay because you are now immune. But that is further commentary on editorializing on this. Ken, I mean, Japan has. I'd love to sort of get your perspective on this. Japan has plenty of corrupt politicians and legal cases that have been run against politicians there, including high level officials, and yet the rule of law has been accepted as an essential part of Japanese society, as it seems to happen in France, and perhaps not as much in the United States or Israel, for that matter, which is facing similar issues right now. How do you look at it?
I don't have any comments on the Japan part, but I do think I understand why the Trump administration has interest in this issue. This morning, Trump wrote on Truth Social that this is a witch hunt, and he called for Marine Le Pen to be freed. And I think, like Suzanne said, this ties into J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, where he said that the biggest enemy for Europe is within, and that you shouldn't silence your own people, and you need a democratic mandate to accomplish anything of value in the coming years. And he also said that the most pressing challenge that the people in this room in Munich face is immigration. So what he's trying to say is that, and through this Marine Le Pen case, is that it kind of proves J.D. Vance and the restrainer's point that the intervening foreign policy of America, led by the neocons, has led to the mass immigration from people of Syria and Iraq into Turkey and to Europe. And this has led to the rise of these right-wing parties. And that if you just listen to the people, these parties would gain more seats, and it's a reflection of the rejection of the immigrants and the rejection of the neocon kind of foreign policy. So I think he's laying the groundwork of Vance's presidency, which will be very different from the neocons, in which America would have a much smaller role. So I didn't answer your Japan part, but I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, and I think that one possibility, though, is that the rival populist project is being given such a full kind of exposure by Trump that it might blow up well before the next presidential election.
Yeah, or even the next midterm elections, and which we may well look back in 2027 when we are discussing the next French presidency and look at Marine Le Pen having won her appeal, being reinstated, running for the presidency, and doing that through the rule of law. Suzanne,
Absolutely, and you're right. I mean, she may still run. And what's quite interesting is that what we do know is that Macron won't run. So there's kind of like who's going to be leading France question. There's no, I mean, Gideon was talking about previous people we thought would be the French president. So it's all to play for in a sense, which makes it very, very interesting. I mean, in a way, Emmanuel Macron's handled this quite well. He made some comments, but he's actually, I think, it'll be a bit, his stature has grown since Trump has come into office. A bit like a lot of foreign leaders. Look at Mark Carney, for example, with the chaos of the Trump presidency. There's a sense that's kind of a wartime spirit almost people are feeling here, and they're looking at their own leaders saying, oh, we all have to come together. And so I think Macron is a little bit more strengthened than he was, say, last summer, where he really was at his lowest point. But yeah, I mean, it is a hugely important question for Europe. Who is running France? They are the second biggest country within the European Union. The Franco-German engine is still that partnership at the heart, particularly since Brexit, at the heart of the EU. So it really matters. And we can see France behind the scenes here, and Germany, but France, driving a lot of policy, be it about defense and security or economic security and tariffs in the next week or so. So it really does matter. France's role as a serious nuclear power, as a serious defense player in Europe. So let's see. But you're right. I mean, there's a lot to play for still. And as you say, the irony would be that if the court does reinstate it or allow her to win, it would be a very different, probably, response from her supporters.
Well, we'll be here when that happens, if it happens, with another edition, I'm sure, of World Review. But in the meantime, I can't think of having a better way to discuss the issues that we discussed today, tariffs, Asia, French politics, than with Suzanne Lynch, who joined us for the first, but certainly not for the last time, Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei Asia. Of course, Suzanne is with Politico, and Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll hope you continue to do so. Listen to us, watch us wherever you can. Leave a comment when you can. But in the meantime, I want to wish all of you a very, very good weekend. And we will see you again next week on another edition of World Review, live from Greece at that point. Thanks.